The late afternoon sun painted the Santa Monica Pier in shades of amber and gold as Margaret wheeled herself slowly along the weathered wooden planks. At 23, she had learned to navigate the world differently than most, but her spirit remained as bright as the carnival lights beginning to flicker on around her. The Ferris wheel turned lazily in the distance while families strolled past with cotton candy, and the distant sound of laughter mixed with seagulls calling overhead. Margaret had always loved this place. Even as a child before the accident that changed everything, she would come here with her grandmother Helen, who would tell stories about the pier's history while they watched the sunset. Now, 3 years after losing her ability to walk, she still found peace in these familiar surroundings. The salt air carried memories of simpler times and reminded her that beauty existed in unexpected moments. She paused near a bench to watch a young father teaching his daughter to throw popcorn to the seagulls. The little girl's giggles reminded Margaret of her own childhood wonder, and she smiled softly. These were the moments that made everything worthwhile. The genuine joy of strangers, the simple pleasure of watching life unfold around her. "Move it, Cripple." The harsh voice cut through the evening air like a blade. Margaret's heart sank as she recognized the tone she had heard too many times before. 3 teenagers approached with that particular swagger that spoke of borrowed confidence and misplaced anger. The leader, a boy of perhaps 17 with bleached hair and cold eyes, sneered down at her. "You're blocking the walkway," he continued, his voice dripping with manufactured cruelty. "Don't you have somewhere else to be pathetic?" Margaret felt the familiar tightness in her chest but kept her voice steady. "I'm just enjoying the sunset," she said quietly. "There's plenty of room for everyone." The second boy laughed without humor. "Yeah, right. Nobody wants to see that." He gestured dismissively at her wheelchair. "This is supposed to be fun, not depressing." Years of occupational therapy had taught Margaret to stay calm in these situations, but her hands trembled slightly as she gripped her wheels. She had learned that responding with anger only made things worse, but the words still cut deep. Each cruel comment was like a small wound that never quite healed. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not bothering anyone. You're bothering us just by existing," the third boy chimed in. "Why don't you go home and let normal people enjoy themselves?" The leader stepped closer, and for a moment Margaret feared he might actually push her. The cruelty in his eyes was real and sharp. Around them, other pier visitors seemed to fade away, either not noticing the confrontation or choosing to look away. Margaret had experienced this invisible barrier before, the way people sometimes pretended not to see when someone needed help. "I said move," the boy repeated, raising his voice. Several passers-by glanced over but kept walking. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized how alone she was in this moment, surrounded by hundreds of people, but truly alone. Then, like thunder rolling across the ocean, came the sound of motorcycles. The deep rumble of Harley-Davidson engines grew louder as a group of bikers rounded the corner onto the pier. At first glance, they looked exactly like what Central Casting would order for a movie about dangerous rebels. Leather vests covered in patches, beards and tattoos, muscles bulging under black t-shirts. The kind of men that parents warned their children about. But Margaret noticed something the teenagers missed. The patches on their vests didn't advertise criminal organizations. Instead, they bore the names of veterans groups, charity rides, and honor guard units. These weren't outlaws, they were protectors. The lead rider, a man in his 50s with graying hair and kind eyes, dismounted his bike and began walking toward them. His name was Frank, and though Margaret didn't know it yet, he was a retired Marine who had spent his adult life learning that true strength meant protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. "Afternoon," Frank said pleasantly, his voice carrying the easy authority of someone who had commanded respect through service rather than fear. "Beautiful day for the pier, isn't it?" The teenagers suddenly seemed much smaller. Their borrowed confidence evaporated as they found themselves surrounded not by an angry mob, but by 24 men and women who simply stood quietly watching. These bikers didn't need to raise their voices or make threats. Their presence alone shifted the entire dynamic. "We were just leaving," the leader mumbled, looking anywhere but at the bikers or Margaret. "Were you now?" Frank said, maintaining his pleasant tone. "That's interesting because I heard you asking this young lady to move. Now that doesn't seem very neighborly to me." Another biker stepped forward. This was Helen, a woman in her 60s whose grandmother had been named Margaret too. She wore a vest with patches indicating she was a retired nurse and a Gold Star mother, who had lost her son in Afghanistan. Her eyes held both tremendous kindness and absolute resolve. "Boys," Helen said in the voice that had once commanded emergency rooms during crisis situations, "I think you might have forgotten something your mothers taught you about treating people with respect." The teenagers shuffled uncomfortably. Up close, it was clear they weren't truly malicious, just young and stupid, and trying to impress each other with false bravado. But their words had still caused real harm, and Margaret could see in Helen's eyes that this wouldn't be overlooked. Frank knelt down beside Margaret's wheelchair, bringing himself to her eye level. His voice dropped to a gentle rumble meant only for her. "You okay, miss?" Margaret nodded, though tears threatened at the corners of her eyes. Not from fear now, but from the unexpected kindness. "Thank you," she whispered. "Nothing to thank us for," Frank replied. "Just neighbors looking out for neighbors." He stood and turned back to the teenagers who were now surrounded by a sea of leather and compassion. "Now, boys, I think you owe this lady an apology. A real one." The silence stretched for several heartbeats. Around them, the pier continued its evening routine, families enjoying carnival games, couples sharing funnel cake, the Ferris wheel carrying passengers toward the darkening sky. But in this small circle, something important was happening. The lead teenager finally looked directly at Margaret for the first time. Without the artificial support of his cruelty, he was revealed as what he truly was, a scared kid who had chosen the wrong way to feel powerful. "I'm sorry," he said, and Margaret could hear that he meant it. That was really messed up. His friends echoed the apology, though theirs sounded more rehearsed. But Margaret accepted them all with a nod, understanding that sometimes people needed to learn empathy the hard way. "Apology accepted," she said simply. "We all make mistakes," Frank smiled at her response. Here was a young woman who had every right to be angry, choosing instead to offer grace. It reminded him of his daughter, who had always seen the best in people even when they didn't deserve it. Helen moved to Margaret's side and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Honey, you mind if we walk with you for a while? We were heading toward the end of the pier anyway." And so an unlikely parade formed. Margaret rolled slowly forward, surrounded by 24 bikers who matched her pace perfectly. They talked about ordinary things, the weather, the beautiful sunset, the way the carnival lights reflected on the water. Some shared stories about their own families, their grandchildren, their hopes for the future. Margaret learned that Frank had been a teacher after leaving the Marines and had spent 30 years helping teenagers find better versions of themselves. Helen told her about her work with wounded veterans and how she had learned that healing often came through connection rather than medicine. Another biker named Robert shared that he had a daughter Margaret's age who was studying to be a social worker. As they walked, Margaret realized something profound was happening. These strangers had not only protected her, they had embraced her as family. Without making a big show of it, they had demonstrated what true strength looked like. Not the hollow cruelty of those teenagers, but the quiet power of people who chose kindness, even when no one was watching. When they reached the end of the pier, the bikers began saying their goodbyes. But Helen lingered beside Margaret's chair. "Honey," she said, "we ride out here most Tuesday evenings around sunset. Weather permitting, of course. You'd be welcome to join us any time." Margaret felt tears welling up again, but this time they were tears of joy. "I'd like that very much." Frank approached with something in his hands. It was a small pin shaped like a motorcycle with wings. "This is for you," he said. "It means your family. Doesn't matter where you are or what's happening, if you need help, you call us." He handed her a card with phone numbers and told her these weren't just empty words. This community took care of its own, and she was now part of that community. As the bikers mounted their motorcycles and rode away into the gathering dusk, Margaret remained at the end of the pier. The Ferris wheel glowed against the darkening sky, and the sound of the ocean provided a gentle soundtrack to her thoughts. She thought about her grandmother Helen, who had always told her that angels came in unexpected forms. The teenagers from earlier approached hesitantly. The leader cleared his throat. Miss, we wanted to apologize again." "Really apologize?" "What we said was horrible." Margaret studied their faces and saw something different now. The encounter with the bikers had stripped away their false personas and revealed